Hello, welcome. My name is Bryant Baker. I am the Director of Conservation and Research at Los Padres Forest Watch. We are a nonprofit conservation organization based in Santa Barbara. We work on a lot of different issues affecting public lands, particularly the Los Padres National Forest, but also the Carrizo Plain National Monument and a couple of other areas within the Central Coast region. And uh, our one of our big things that we have been working on over the last several years is fighting some of these really bad proposals that we've been seeing from the Forest Service. A lot of these are related to wildfire mitigation. Trying to reduce the impacts of wildfires on communities, but also on ecosystems. But a lot of what we're seeing that's actually being proposed uh, is very problematic from an ecological standpoint and is often ineffective in terms of wildfire mitigation. So I'm gonna talk a lot about that today as I discuss the latest proposal, which is called the Ecological Restoration Project. So I'm gonna share my screen here. You should be able to see my PowerPoint. Just let me know in the chat if you can't see my stuff or if you can't hear me. And I can try to work that out. So yeah, we're gonna focus today on San Luis Obispo County and Monterey County. And if you've missed the other webinars, I did a webinar a few weeks ago that was just sort of a broad overview of this project proposal in the Los Padres National Forest. And then we've done a couple of webinars over the last couple of weeks that are focused on specific areas. So we did one on Ventura County and Southern Kern County, that part of the Los Padres. And then the other day we did one on Santa Barbara County. So this is the first time that we've done a webinar that is really focused on SLO County and Monterey County in relation to this large proposal. So the project that is being proposed, it's called the Ecological Restoration Project. It's about 235,000 acres in size, and it covers a huge chunk of the Los Padres National Forest and is very distributed across the national forest. There are sort of two types of this project, or two types of project areas. So there are what are called forest health treatment units. Those are between 48,000 and 49,000 acres. And then there are 186,000 acres of what they're calling fuel break and defense zones. And I'll explain what both of those are here in just a bit. If you look at the distribution of the project area in terms of counties, you can see a lot of it is in Santa Barbara County. That just is because Santa Barbara County is a huge portion of the Los Padres National Forest. But there is a lot of acreage in San Luis Obispo County and also in Monterey County. And so that's, again, what we're going to be focusing on today. And most of that is fuel break and defense zones. So just to get this out of the way, the Forest Service, they have these three overarching goals that they're saying, are why they're doing the project. They want to restore vegetation resiliency to environmental stressors and improve forest health, increase community and infrastructure protection. And then the third one is sort of, it's kind of a mix of the other two, but improve wildfire containment opportunities by establishing and maintaining fuel breaks and defense zones. In other words, they're kind of saying, these ecosystems out in the Los Padres they're unhealthy, they're dangerous. We've got to go in and, quote, fix them and try to mitigate wildfire. I'm going to explain throughout this presentation why these goals are not going to be met with this project, and why we're just kind of the Forest Service is already in a completely warped mindset about a lot of this and how that is posing a serious issue here with this project. So I just want you to see some of the other projects that we've been dealing with over the last few years. Those are the areas in red. So the Mount Pinos project, that is the most recent before the Ecological Restoration Project. It still hasn't been approved, but is pending a decision right now. There's also the Takuya Ridge and Cuddy Valley projects up here. These are all up in the Mount Pinos region. The Pine Mountain Reyes Peak project, that that got a lot of public backlash over the last couple of years. Three of these projects are actually being litigated or have been litigated. And then there was a project that some folks don't really know about, but it was this big fuel break project in the Monterey Ranger District up here in the Big Sur area. And that was approved back in 2018. It was not litigated to my knowledge. And I assume that a lot of that fuel break work has already been done. So you can see, there have definitely been some projects. These were all proposed for sort of the same reasons, wildfire mitigation or forest health. So the Forest Service says, and we really thought that this was a lot of acreage. We were really concerned and are still concerned about these projects, and we've raised a lot of those concerns to the Forest Service, and uh, these are dwarfed by this latest proposal. I mean, it is just mind-boggling. So here is the Ecological Restoration Project. All of the yellow areas and these brown areas, those are all part of this latest project area, and a lot of it is adjacent to these previous projects. But in comparison, it is just absolutely massive. I mean, a lot of like the southern Monterey Ranger District that isn't part of designated wilderness is included in this project area. The entirety of Westquester Ridge, for the most part, is within this project area. I mean, this is a really, really big proposal, and it is something that we are taking very, very seriously here at Los Padres Forest Watch. So again, I'm going to just focus on the San Luis Obispo and Monterey County portions of this project. And I think it'll probably lean a little bit more towards SLO County, just because we work more in SLO County than we do up in Monterey County. A great organization that does a lot of work up in the Big Sur area, the Ventana Wilderness Alliance. They if you're more interested in, they have, I'm sure they have concerns about this project, and I would recommend reaching out to them and getting their take on a lot of this stuff as well. I will discuss the potential impacts to the Big Sur area, though, just a bit here shortly. So the main ecosystems that are sort of being targeted and are threatened by this project, the main one by far is Chaparral, and this is our beloved shrubland ecosystem. It's an evergreen ecosystem. It's got these really cool shrubs like these manzanitas and ceanothus and chamise, and I could spend the next hour or so just listing off all the cool plants that occur in this ecosystem, but it's characterized by these shrubs that are, again, evergreen. They don't lose their leaves all at once each year, like deciduous plants, and they usually have kind of leathery leaves. That this is a type of sclerophyll vegetation. It's a very, very interesting ecosystem and has a unique relationship with wildfire, but it is definitely the predominant ecosystem on the landscape. Up in the SLO area, it's also has a lot of really cool, rare and endemic species, especially in terms of manzanitas. I would say the sort of epicenter of biodiversity for manzanitas is on the Central Coast, and particularly around the SLO area. There's just a lot of really cool species. This is the Bishop manzanita that is growing up on Westquester Ridge. So really cool ecosystem. The other big ecosystem that is going to be impacted by this project is oak woodland. There are several different types of oak woodlands. The main one here, though, would be coast live oak. That's what you see here. These tend to occur on kind of shadier, moisture sites, like on north-facing slopes, especially as you move south down into the Los Padres National Forest. And then one of my favorite ecosystems besides Chaparral is the close-cone pine cypress forest that you can find mainly on Westquester Ridge and to some extent on Eastquester Ridge. Really, really cool ecosystem, very unique, and it is going to be heavily impacted by this proposal. This is Westquester Ridge. This is Sargent cypress, very, very interesting species. That's Los Osos in the background, and it's just an incredible place. And this is the very first image you saw on my intro slide. And this is all mostly knobcone pine. There might be looks like there might be a coulter pine right there. Hard to tell, but this is such a cool species of conifer. Um, it's another closed cone species where the cones stay pretty tightly closed on the tree for many years to decades until fire opens them up um, and lets the seeds come out. So these are a type of serotinous species that, again, they only really drop their seeds after fire comes through. Birds will definitely get in there and they'll pry these cones open, and the cones can eventually sort of decay if enough time has passed without fire, and they can open up that way. But anyway, this is a really cool ecosystem, especially on Westquester Ridge. The other one that I think is very unique to the more northern part of the Los Padres National Forest is, of course, Coast Redwood Forest, which you'll find in the Monterey Ranger District up in the Big Sur area. This is a great example of what it looks like in the Big Sur area, and this is actually a post-fire image. It might be hard to tell, but I think, if I remember correctly, where I was when I took this photo, I think I took this back in 2018. And this area had burned in 1999. I think it burned in the Kirk Creek fire, but I can't remember exactly which fire it was. But you can see some of that char on the trunks of the trees. You can see some charred logs and things like that. But the regrowth was really spectacular just in the less than 20 years that occurred between the fire and when I took this. So when we look at San Luis Obispo County, that portion of the Los Padres National Forest, what you'll notice is that the majority of it is chaparral or some form of shrubland. Most of this like lighter green color, this is chaparral. There's some different types of chaparral. You'll get some areas that are more dominated by chamise or its sibling redshanks. But you also find areas that are more manzanita dominated or ceanothus dominated. But regardless, you have chaparral across most of this area, and it is quite the dominant ecosystem. There are definitely places where you get more oak woodland, especially again in these kind of moister sites that are often in canyons and on north-facing slopes. And there are some areas that are more grassy, and a lot of that is non-native grasses that are part of these grassland ecosystems. How long they have been naturally grassland, or how those areas became grassland is another question, another issue. But what I will say is that where you see this yellow, that is often heavily dominated by non-native grasses like wild oats, for example. And then if you look really closely, you'll see again on this Cuesta Ridge area, you'll see this color of green. That's the closed cone pine cypress. And so on West Cuesta Ridge, it's more of the Sargent cypress forest. And then on East Cuesta Ridge, it's a lot more coulter pine and knobcone pine. Very, very fascinating area up here, and would be pretty heavily impacted by the project, as you can see here. So this is the same data that you're seeing, just restricted to the project area specifically. And so what you'll notice, if you just think about this visually, you'll see that again, the majority of what is being targeted in San Luis Obispo County is chaparral. There's a lot of that closed cone pine cypress, especially on West Cuesta Ridge, that's included in the project area. And then there's some oak woodland, but there's not a lot of that like true conifer forest in the way you might envision conifer forest. There's not really much mixed conifer or Jeffrey Ponderosa pine forest. You definitely get some of that if we go up to the Monterey Ranger District. There's definitely some mixed conifer forest and some Jeffrey pine, dominated forest. That's a little bit more common up here, but as you're kind of closer to the coast, and especially in the canyon areas, you'll get a lot of the coast redwood forest as well. But even the Big Sur area is still mostly chaparral, quite a bit more oak woodland than in some other places, though. And again, this is just the project area looking at the same data, and so the majority of the project's impacts will be in the southern part of the Monterey Ranger District. There's especially a big contiguous area here, which is quite an interesting mix of ecosystems, a lot of chaparral and coastal sage scrub, but also quite a bit of coast redwood forest, some oak woodlands, some sort of like almost kind of like mixed evergreen forest, a lot of bay laurel, things like that. Um, so that you know is what we're looking at in terms of the ecosystem distribution. And all of these data, by the way, this is from a Forest Service data set actually called CalVeg, and um, this is their own data. So let's just talk about these different project area types. So there's the forest health treatment units. Again, it's actually about it's almost 49,000 acres. I was looking at the data again last night and realized it's 48,800 acres. And in these areas, what they are wanting to do is do a lot of what we would call like canopy reduction. They're trying to um, uh, thin out the forest quite a bit, and they and thereby opening up the forest. They are allowing trees up to 24 inches in diameter to be removed. This tree right here, this is me. I'm 5'10". You can I, I'm standing next to this tree. This is a 23.5-inch diameter tree. And so I would not call this a small tree, but the Forest Service is saying anything less than 24 inches is a small tree, and therefore they can remove it and still claim that they're trying to retain larger trees. This, of course, tree size distribution is different depending on what forest ecosystem you're in. This is a Jeffrey pine in a fairly dry area. This is on Pine Mountain in Ventura County. And this tree can be anywhere between 80 and 120 years old in a lot of cases. So I would not say it is a small tree, and it's certainly not a young tree. A lot of this is mature and old growth as well. And the way that they would actually do this work is through mostly mechanical means, likely. So this is from their project description, which is like a 17-page document that just sort of lays out what they're wanting to do. And this is what they say would be allowed in these forest health treatment units. So it's, again, a lot of mechanical or hand cutting, but also mowing and masticating and chipping and pile burning. I'll explain what some of those things mean here in a bit. Just to give you a sense of what this actually looks like in practice, we're looking at a satellite image of the Plumas National Forest. So this is up like northwest of Lake Tahoe, that area. In fact, it's part of an area that burned in the Dixie Fire last year. This is a ponderosa pine forest. I think this forest is very, very open already. In fact, it's more open than you might even realize, because a lot of what you're seeing is just the tree shadows. These are the canopies casting a shadow. So it makes it look a little bit more dense than it really is. But if you look at just the green canopies, you can see it's a very open forest, not much in the understory either. The Forest Service said, this area is way too dense. We've got to go in and do a forest health project. We've got to do some commercial thinning and remove trees. I think they were removing trees up to 30 inches in diameter on this project. They approved this project with a categorical exclusion, so they didn't do an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, but their targets in terms of what they were wanting to reduce the amount of trees and biomass to were very, very similar to what we saw proposed in the Pine Mountain project. And it's very similar, likely, to what we will see fleshed out in this current project, the Ecological Restoration Project, as we get more information about that project. So again, this is the area before the work actually started. This was in 2014. And this is what it looked like towards the tail end of the project being completed. And so what you see on the landscape, obviously the forest has been really drastically opened up even more than it already was. And again, it was a very open forest to begin with. But this is a landing zone here. This is where they will actually take logs and stack them up to either be put in on a log truck to be taken to a mill. In some cases, these logs will even be chipped and sent to a biomass facility to burn to create electricity. Those are the canopies there that have been cut. That's like your classic logging slash, and those will probably be pile burned if I had to guess. These they look like little roads. These are called skid trails. This is from this back and forth movement across the landscape with heavy equipment, very intensive, management here, and a lot of effects on soil and potentially water quality. There's actually a riparian area over here that could be impacted by this likely increased erosion from a lot of this activity. And of course, a bunch of impacts to the understory vegetation as well. This is a project area from the Los Padres National Forest on Figueroa Mountain, which is in Santa Barbara County. This is a non-commercial project, so they actually had a diameter limit. They were at least for live trees. I think some of these might have been dead, and I'm hoping that's why I'm seeing some larger logs here. But again, this is a non-commercial project, and this is what this area has looked like for years. A lot of logging, a lot of slash here. The Forest Service wouldn't like that I call it logging, but they are cutting and they're felling trees. That is logging by definition, and yeah, this is like a big slash pile. So this is something that they would eventually do a pile burn in, where they basically burn this until it's completely gone, and that usually takes days. And so it's kind of like a bonfire, and that of course carries issues like for soil quality and other things. But this is what we see even in non-commercial projects. This is another non-commercial project. It had a stricter diameter limit. I can't remember which one. This was either like 10 or 12 inches, I want to say. So you can see that they've just recently, before I took this photo last year, they just cut a bunch of trees, and they left the slash on the ground for basically the whole fire season, as far as I'm aware. And that can increase fire risk in the short term for sure. And you can see they've really opened up the canopy. They've opened up sunlight, to the forest floor. This can have impacts on microclimate and all sorts of things. But again, this is sort of a lower impact non-commercial project that didn't involve heavy equipment. This was all hand cutting. But even then, you can see that it's still there are impacts. This is more of the classic commercial thinning operation, and this is up in Northern California. I don't know exactly where. A colleague of mine took this photo, but you can see the Forest Service will sort of portray these as, they'll call them thinning projects, and they make it sort of sound like, oh, we're just out there removing small trees, young trees, saplings. They'll call those ladder fuels. We got to get rid of these small trees because if a fire comes through here, they'll burn, and then they send flames up into the canopies of the taller trees. There's quite a bit of nuance to that. But regardless, what actually happens in practice is that a lot of large trees will get removed if these allow a commercial component. And these trees can be sold to a mill, or they can be sold to a biomass facility. But the impacts are pretty severe here. Large tree removal, a lot of carbon, removal from this ecosystem, and basically what amounts to like an understory clear cut, just no understory vegetation like whatsoever in this area. So one of the things that we're concerned about with these forest health treatment units is the fact that most of the area that has been designated as forest health treatment units is not very close to an existing road. So I did this analysis recently and found that 86% of these forest health treatment units are more than a quarter mile away from a road. And if we go back real quick to this, I did this last night. I was thinking about this image, and I measured it. Everything you see is within a quarter of a mile from this road. So even when it's close to roads, you still are going to have a lot of these, skid trails. They still have these landings out here, but those issues will only magnify the farther you get away from existing roads. And I also included off-road vehicle trails too, just to try to be conservative here. And yeah, there's not a lot of access into these areas, which would indicate that they're going to have to create a lot of these skid trails and potentially temporary road construction. That hasn't been ruled out. I don't think they have anything in their project description that says they won't do temporary road construction. So that is something that we're concerned about. So now sort of shifting gears to the fuel break and defense zones. Again, this is sort of the meat of the project, 186,000 acres in areas where there are trees. they have no diameter limits here. So again, in the forest health treatment units, they had a 24-inch diameter limit. In the fuel breaks, though, they are saying they can remove trees of any size, any age, and they will, I think their language is that they will retain some trees, but we have no idea what that actually means. And in practice, these fuel breaks just get really, really intensively cut, and they can look kind of like linear clear cuts across the landscape with, a couple trees here and there. And they can do this through a lot of different methods. And I should mention, it's not just trees here. Obviously I'm focusing on that with the diameter, but a lot of these fuel break and defense zones are actually really focused on chaparral and more shrub dominated ecosystems. So that's where we would expect to see a lot of mastication, a lot of mechanical work, with heavy equipment, but they would allow several other, activities here that could potentially cause some negative ecological impacts. But I think the main way that we'll see fuel breaks created is the way that we've seen them created for the last several decades in the Los Padres. Sorry. This is an area in Santa Barbara County. This is along Camino Cielo. If you're familiar with that area, this was a fuel break that was being created and masticated. And so this is a masticator. This is allowed in this current project proposal. So you can see there's a guy in there just to give you a sense of how big this thing is. And basically what it's doing is it's just mulching these native shrubs down. So if you can imagine, I wish I had a video of it, although it's kind of depressing to watch, but this shrub might be next, and it would just start at the top and then grind it down into this mulch material that you see. So a lot of impacts here, impacts to wildlife, impacts obviously to the vegetation community, to the vegetation structure, but also impacts to soil. You've got this heavy equipment out here. You can see there's a lot of soil damage that's occurring, especially back here. These are really serious activities, and they can carry a lot of impacts on the landscape, not just in the area where they're actually doing the work, but this has implications for the adjacent areas as well, especially in terms of invasive plant spread. Because what we see is that in these fuel break areas, you will see a lot of invasive plants take hold. But there again, you can see this is part of that same project. You can see some really heavy soil damage going on there. And here's another view of this the same fuel break project. Standing in it is a pretty depressing thing to experience. And in this one, this is so weird to me, but they left a couple of shrubs. I don't know why. I don't think these were rare shrub species, but yeah, this is just really bizarre. This is not what I would call ecological restoration. Certainly not creating a healthy chaparral ecosystem. This is mature chaparral on either side. This is what it would have looked like, and this was already quite healthy. So yeah, this is a serious issue. Here's another view with a person in it, just to give you a sense of the scope and the scale. But there's another way that these fuel breaks can get created in chaparral. It's not as common as far as I know, but I did go and visit one up in or down in the Cleveland National Forest, so way down south. And I think this was in Orange County. And so this one had just been created. This is again mature chaparral, but I think they did mostly hand cutting here, and you can tell because of all the piles. So they've got all these this piled material that will eventually, I assume, be burned. And this may not look. It's hard to convey the scale here, but like there's a road here. There's like a 2-lane road right there going through the middle of this. This is a big area, and like this is a little fence, but these piles are quite large, and a lot of what's coming up. This is like in the winter when I visited, but you can already see a lot of these invasive grasses were coming up in this area, and this is what this zone looked like before they did this work. A lot of chamise, a lot of ceanothus, just major damage here to the ecosystem. What eventually happens over time with these fuel breaks is that they get basically type converted from generally from like chaparral, if that was the dominant ecosystem where they did the work. This will eventually end up being dominated by invasive grasses and weeds like wild oats, which you can see here in the foreground, kind of out of focus. This is a common species, especially up in San Luis Obispo County. Also here in Santa Barbara County, where I am. This is Camino Cielo. This is West Camino Cielo in Santa Barbara County. If you're familiar with that area, this is a massive fuel break. It was it's been around since the 70s, but you can see over time it has become very type converted. I would not call this a healthy ecosystem by any means. And you can see it's along a road. And one of the concerns here is that we see human-caused ignitions predominantly on the landscape. They're close to roads. And so when you're also creating fuel breaks along these road systems, and you're converting native vegetation to this highly flammable and ignitable non-native grasses and weeds, then you can increase ignition risk, and that's a big concern here. Just to give you a sense, again, this is the same sort of fuel break network, but this is farther east in the San Ynez Mountains. But I was working on this yesterday, and I found I love going through old historical aerial imagery. So I found this one of the Arroyo Burrow area, and it's okay if you're not familiar with this area. Just know this is in the San Ynez Mountains. This is at the very top of the mountains, and it's like Santa Barbara is just directly south out of view here. But this is from 1943, so you can see this area, mostly, chaparral. There's definitely some fragmentation happening from old, like a bulldozer line, but also a road that's going through here. And then here's what it looks like in 2021, and you can really see that type conversion that has happened over the last several decades, and it is really intense in this area. So where it was mostly chaparral, it is now mostly non-native grasses, particularly the wild oats, and then also some non-native weeds like black mustard. And I actually have a photo. I've spent a lot of time in this area, but I'm going to show you a photo, and I'm standing like right over here looking this way, so you can see this area. This is what it looks like on the ground. Again, I would not call this ecological restoration. It is not a healthy ecosystem. I'm not sure what ecosystem even to call it. I guess it's technically kind of a grassland at this point, but it is almost exclusively non-native grasses and weeds. There's a lot of mustard here in the foreground, and you'll see, a native shrub here and there, some yucca that has been able to stick around. But yeah, this has been heavily degraded. And so when we look at like San Luis Obispo County, one of the areas of concern for us is the Cuesta Ridge and specifically the Westquester Ridge area. Most of the Westquester Ridge area is included within the project, including the Cuesta Ridge Botanical Area. This is a special interest management area. This is like basically a specially designated place in the Los Padres National Forest that the Forest Service is supposed to manage for a particular purpose. And that purpose in this case is to manage, to protect the very rare and endemic species that occur there. So you've got a lot of Sargent cypress growing there, but also some other interesting and rare species like the Bishop manzanita or the Cuesta Ridge thistle, for example. Some of these you can really only find on this ridge, and so this is supposed to be highly protected. But it is entirely included in this project, and mostly as a fuel break and defense zone, which would again allow all that mastication. And it's a major concern here. They also have a lot of these forest health treatment units on Westquester Ridge, which is really weird because it is mostly the forest type that occurs there is closed cone, pine, cypress. This is the Cuesta Ridge Botanical Area. If you've never been here, I highly recommend it. One of my favorite places in the Los Padres National Forest, just endlessly fascinating. And I'll talk a little bit more actually here in a moment about this area. But I do actually, I want to talk a little bit about this sort of perception that I think the Forest Service is putting out there, which is that a lot of these landscapes have, like they're wanting to restore them to some point in time. And usually that point in time, sometimes they'll say pre-settlement, which is very difficult to know what ecosystems looked like exactly before colonization. But a lot of times what they'll point to is just, they'll say, 100 years, the last 100 years of fire suppression has changed these ecosystems really drastically. And we've got to, do all this work so that we can restore them to this pre-fire suppression era. But a lot of these ecosystems haven't been impacted by fire suppression the way that most people think, especially chaparral. I mean, there's been a lot of studies about this that have found that fire suppression hasn't actually changed chaparral much, especially in Southern California and on the Central Coast. And if anything, the real issue is actually that over the last many decades, we've had more ignitions on the landscape because of human activity, because we now have, millions of people living in these areas. And a lot of these chaparral dominated landscapes are actually burning too frequently. But but still, you'll kind of get this sense that, like, oh, there's too much vegetation out there, it's too dense, right? And it's got to be restored. But so I just want to show you a couple of like historical images here. This is in the La Panza Mountains, the La Panza Range in SLO County in the Los Padres National Forest. This is 1936, and what you can see is dense, mature chaparral dominated by chamise. I mean, this was the norm almost 100 years ago, and it looks virtually identical today. This is a cool area in near Machesney, in the Machesney Mountain area near Castle Crags, if you're familiar with that. This is mostly coulter pine, but a lot of chaparral as well, a lot of dense, mature chaparral dominated by manzanita, mostly up there. But you can see there's a lot of these coulter pines, really cool species that often grows right alongside shrubs in the chaparral. And here is that same-ish area. I didn't see this photo actually until earlier today. I came across this photo. But I'm going to go back out there and try to replicate that exact image. But this is the same area. This is the same place for the most part. But you can see a lot of coulter pine, dense chaparral, very, very similar. And in fact, actually, this area burned back in I want to say 1990. I can't remember what. It was definitely in the 90s. It was either 94 or 96. But this area did burn, and so there's a lot of new coulter pine growth. This is another species that is what I would call like semi-serotinous. So sometimes the cones will stay closed until they get heated up from fire. Sometimes they don't. This area, I did notice a lot of closed cones on these coulters, so they could be a little bit more serotinous than in other places. But this is a fascinating area, really, really beautiful place out there. And here's another image from kind of that same area. This is the Castle Crags in the Machesney Mountain Wilderness. And I have almost the same image. I didn't know about this image until today. And then I was looking at my own photos, and I realized, I almost got that same image. And again, it looks almost identical. And that just has a lot to do with the sort of natural disturbance regimes and dynamics of this ecosystem. But yeah, a lot of coulter pine growing right alongside some really cool mixed chaparral, lots of manzanita, and there's actually some cool like rare species of manzanitas over in this area. And then this is Westquester Ridge. This is what it looked like in 1937 from the air. So this is an aerial image. We're looking down on it. And this is what it looks like. That's supposed to say 2021, actually. So disregard the 1937. This is today, roughly. And this is 1937. It's very, very similar. And a lot of this area actually burned in the early 90s in the Highway 41 fire. And so you can actually see there's sort of some cool patterns here, because this is mostly Sergeant Cypress. So you can see there must have been a fire sometime before 1937. I don't know how long before it, but probably within the previous few decades. And you can see some patterns where like some of the Sergeant Cypress didn't quite burn. And so some of it is taller and older. In some places here in this 1937 photo, and then other areas is where it has come up really vigorously from seed. And so it's a lot younger and really dense. The same patterns you can see, just not quite in the same exact spots, but you can see that same sort of structure here where this area didn't quite burn in the 1994 fire, but this area did. So there's some really cool stuff here, but just my point is this ecosystem hasn't drastically changed in the last 100 years the way I think the Forest Service would have you think. This is an image from 1936 of that exact area. This is mostly Sergeant Cypress, but there's definitely some coulter pine in here, and there's a lot of manzanita, a lot of that bishop manzanita. Just really cool, but again, very dense habitat here, and that's just how it occurs naturally. Here is an image from 2021 of that same area. You've got some more mature Sergeant Cypress, but a lot of this area is what burned, and so you can see a lot of young Sergeant Cypress that has been coming up over the last few decades. Same here. This is an area that was burned, and you can see just really, really vigorous regrowth from seed. And again, these are this is a serotinous species in the sense that those little cones. The cones look a little different because they're cypresses, but those don't really open until they get heated up from fire. So when that happens, when a fire comes through, it kills all the adult individuals for the most part. Definitely it'll leave some of those patches where it doesn't kill all the adults, but then you'll have this, like, what we call seed rain, where then all these seeds drop on this fresh bare soil, and then we'll regrow. It's really really cool process. Here's another image, so you can see some of these old trees that were killed by the fire. And so these are dead, these are snags, but they're still there. Actually, you can still see some charcoal on some of them. So a lot of the carbon is even still in the ecosystem in the form of dead wood. And I can't talk enough about Questa Ridge, apparently, but this is such a cool place. If you've never been, highly recommend it. Some really cool Sergeant Cypress. It's actually how to put this. It's not flowering. These are not flowering plants, but they've got their little male pollen cones out when I took this photo. And so that's what this brown is. The tree isn't dying or anything. This is just what it looks like when it's putting out a bunch of pollen. And you can see, if you look really closely, you can see some Bishop manzanita growing in there, kind of trying to get some light here with all this Sergeant Cypress nearby. Now in Chaparral areas, just to give you a sense of what is the norm in terms of how these areas burn, I think this is really important to understand, but it is normal to see an area where it was dense, mature chaparral, it then burns and everything seems like it dies for the first several weeks or months. It will be a blackened landscape, a lot of blackened stems, a lot of charcoal. But given enough time, just 5 months in this case, you will get a new growth of what we call fire followers. So this is a type of Phacelia that you only see growing for a couple of years in post-fire chaparral areas. Very cool native plant, very, very interesting dynamic with fire. And what you'll also see, though, is if all goes correctly, and when I say that, I mean, especially if areas haven't burned in a long time, that's actually better for chaparral. And I can talk a little bit more about that later, but you get all this. So again, a lot of shrubs, they look completely dead. I would imagine that the average person who maybe isn't familiar with chaparral ecology would look at this image and say, oh, well, everything is dead, and like maybe nothing is going to ever regrow there. It looks like the soil's been sterilized. So this is 1 month after the fire. This is all the same image that you're seeing, right? So this is just sort of a slice of the image over here, but at a different time. This is 16 months later, and you can see almost every single one of these stems resprouted, because most of these particular shrub species are resprouting species. They're able to resprout from their base. And then you also have a lot of new growth coming up from seed in these sort of interstitial spaces there. And so it is normal to see this view. I just think people have a hard time wrapping their head around this, but this is what it looks like after chaparral burns. And then there is this beautiful process of regrowth. If it doesn't burn too soon afterward, if it hasn't been degraded by invasive plants, there are caveats to this for sure. But this is an area that was old growth chaparral, it then burned, and we had some decent rains after that, and it has done really, really well. And I've been sort of tracking the growth of these areas for the last couple of years since this fire occurred. Yeah, so it's a really neat process. Now, in contrast, this is a fuel break. This is that same area that I just showed you. So that photo that I just showed you, that the slice of that photo, from different times after the fire, I was basically standing, I don't know where I was standing, somewhere over here looking this way. Right next to this area is actually a fuel break. Is the same fuel break that I showed a bunch of photos of. This area all burned as well. So when I first visited this area, it was 1 week after the fire. This was all blackened ground. A couple of these shrubs did survive, but it was still, all the grasses have been burned. And what you see is that I think this is 5 months after the fire, and you've already got redevelopment of those non-native grasses. This is all wild oats, a lot of mustard in here as well, and some star thistle, things like that. So that's all redeveloped, which is not good. And then the chaparral is doing its own thing. This was old growth chaparral. It's recovering very nicely. I would not call this a healthy ecosystem. I would not call this fuel break a form of ecological restoration. In fact, the fire itself started in this fuel break and then moved down into this old growth chaparral. So if this doesn't highlight if this doesn't illustrate the issue here, I'm not sure what does. Now, again, if you have fire that's occurring too frequently, you will see loss of certain species. This is an area that burned in 2017, and it was re-burning an area that had just burned 8 or 9 years before that. And so what you're seeing is that a lot of these ceanothus species that aren't able to resprout, they rely on a soil seed bank that is stimulated by the fire, but they had not had a chance to grow to maturity and start putting out a bunch of seed. And so there wasn't that seed bank there to grow from. And so even 3 years after the fire, the second fire, there's basically no ceanothus growth here. And so we would expect to see a gradual loss of the species, especially if this keeps reburning at this interval. So fire should not be occurring too frequently. We generally talk about the fire regime in Chaparral as being, a fire would occur in a given area once every 30 to 150 years or so. Now, I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to talk about redwoods because I think this is important, especially for the Monterey Ranger District area. But I think people maybe don't understand how redwoods deal with fire, and it's fascinating. So I'm going to just show you an area. This is Big Basin State Park. This is before the CZU complex fire, which happened back in 2020, and you may have read about that. Maybe you've been to the park since then. But there was a lot of concern that all the redwoods were killed. And, when you look at the immediate post-fire, we're looking at satellite imagery. When you look at that immediate post-fire imagery, it certainly looks like all the redwoods have been killed. I mean, this is pretty high intensity fire. This is all the canopy has been, burned away, basically. This is pretty intense, and I don't blame people for thinking, oh, well, all the trees must be dead. And that was sort of what was reported in the early days after this fire, was that Big Basin was basically destroyed. I mean, there were definitely structures destroyed there, but the forest being destroyed, that was a notion that has been out there in the world. But what's really cool is when we look at the same spot with the same imagery, but from 2022. So this was taken in June. You'll notice something. Most of those trees, those mature trees, the redwoods specifically, there's definitely some Doug fir in here, and there's madrones and stuff like that. The Doug firs can't do this, but madrones can resprout, bay laurels can resprout, but the redwoods are really cool because they have something called epicormic sprouting. So they can actually sprout from their trunk and from their branches. And that's exactly what you're seeing here. You would be hard pressed to find mature redwoods that actually were outright killed by this fire. Instead, they definitely lost their canopy, their pre-fire canopy, but they're in this sort of phase that we would call bottle brushing, where they are putting out a bunch of new branch growth from their trunk. And that's what you're seeing here. They look kind of bushy up and down the trunk. It's really fascinating. But again, most of the trees survived here. The canopy has changed and it will redevelop over time. But there wasn't as much tree mortality as you might suspect. And this is what it looks like from the ground. This is that epicormic sprouting. It is absolutely fascinating. It's a really cool thing. Not a lot of conifers can do it, but redwoods are really well known for it. Big cone Douglas firs can do it as well. Those are farther south, but the true Douglas firs can't do it. So it's a little strange, but yeah, this is what it looks like. This is that more classic bottle brushing. And then this is an example. This is a Douglas fir that actually was killed by the fire, but the redwoods next to it survived and are redeveloping their canopy. So we would expect to see that even in the Monterey Ranger District, where you do get scorching of these redwoods. As long as that's not happening really frequently, then you should see canopy redevelopment between fires. Coast live oaks can do this as well. So this is 17 months after a fire, and this tree was blackened from head to toe. I actually thought it was dead initially, but it has started redeveloping its canopy really well. So it also has this epicormic sprouting ability. And you can see this. This is an area in Ventura County. This was oak woodland before the Thomas fire. This was right after the Thomas fire, and it looks like it was completely destroyed by the fire. But then give it like 4 years, and you can see most of those mature oaks survived, and they are redeveloping their canopy. You can see all these green canopies, but you can also see the shadows that they're casting. So this oak woodland is doing really well 4 years after a pretty intense fire that came through here. The other cool thing I mentioned a minute ago, but bay laurels, and you got a lot of bay laurel up in the Monterey Ranger District, especially. They are one of the best basal sprouting species I've ever seen. I mean, they put out so much growth in a short amount of time after fire. It is incredible. So this is my partner, Gabby. She's not like 10 feet tall. She's an average sized human, and she's standing next to this this really cool area that had a bunch of mature bay laurels, and they have resprouted. This is about 4 years after a fire came through here. And again, if you had come through this area a week after the fire, you would have thought these trees were dead. They're not dead. Just the above ground part of their biomass was killed, but then they were able to resprout from their base, and they're doing really well here. So all of that was to say, you have to understand fire ecology to understand why this project, which is sort of being pitched to the public as like we're trying to protect ecosystems from fire, you have to understand how these ecosystems actually deal with fire. Everything I just showed you is a great example of resilience. These ecosystems are inherently resilient to fire. What that means is they can be changed pretty drastically by the fire, but that change is temporary, and they eventually redevelop. They reassemble into something that looks like the ecosystem that was there before the fire. What the Forest Service is really wanting to do, and this is not what they're saying in their documents, but I think they're confusing the terms, and these have actual ecological definitions, the term resistance and resilience. So what you're seeing on screen right now, that's a form of resilience. Resistance would have been if the fire came through and you couldn't really tell that a fire came through. It didn't change much about the structure of this ecosystem. That is certainly something, that can happen, and some ecosystems do have like more inherent resistance to fire and other disturbances. But if the goal is to improve resilience, I would say these ecosystems are already quite resilient. Now, the other big question is, does any of this actually work to mitigate fire? And so we can look at it from the standpoint of fire spread. And here is a big fuel break. This is that Camino Cielo fuel break. I've shown several photos of this area. This is in the San Ynez Mountains before the Whittier fire. And so this is the fuel break running along the crest of the mountains there. And then the fire started over here in 2017, burned up to the top of the ridge. Embers were blown over that fuel break down to this area. Then it started burning its way back up. It crossed this fuel break multiple times. It did not stop the fire from going from one side of the mountain to the other. And this fuel break was first established in the 70s. And the whole point of it was to stop fires from crossing the crest of the San Ynez Mountains. That was the entire point of this fuel break, because there had been a big fire in the 50s called the Refugio fire that burned a lot of this area, and it burned on both sides of the mountains. And the Forest Service did not like that. And so they put this big fuel break through here. And it just did not work in this case. And the greater the wind speeds that you have, the more extreme weather conditions you have, the less effective these types of projects are, especially these fuel breaks. Here's an example from the SLO County area. This is Westquester Ridge, and I know there's some people actually in attendance right now who remember this project being implemented, being proposed and implemented. But the agency wanted to put a fuel break along Westquester Ridge, along the sort of crest here. And so this is what it looked like before in 1963, and then this is what it looked like after in 1968. So you can see the fuel break has been implemented, big linear swath of land that has been basically clear cut. And then the question is, well, did this help mitigate wildfire spread in the future? So we can look at 1989, fuel break still there, very visible here. And a few years later, 1994, it burned in a wildfire. Everything you see in this image burned in this 1994 fire. And the fire crossed this fuel break multiple times. The fuel break is basically bisecting this fire, and it didn't do anything to stop the fire from spreading across this ridge. So the answer is, these fuel breaks, sometimes they can be effective, usually under mild weather conditions, but that's not when fires pose the greatest risk to communities. And so the way we come to think of it, and this is what the science supports too, is that these fuel breaks don't work to stop those weather-driven fires. They don't even really help mitigate the spread of them indirectly either. So they're not very useful for the fires that are actually of most concern to communities. Hopefully that makes sense. This is from a big study in 2011 that looked at this, and one of the things that they concluded was constructing fuel breaks in remote backcountry locations isn't going to help save homes during a wildfire. And that's because embers that are often being blown miles in front of the fire are what are actually causing homes to ignite. Embers can get sucked into vents and cracks underneath your door, through an open window, you name it. Embers, if they're able to get in the house, it can ignite it from the inside. And that is the main issue. And that's why we advocate that instead of doing all this backcountry vegetation removal, we really need to be focusing on trying to harden these homes, trying to retrofit them so that they are ember resistant, but also doing some vegetation management immediately around structures that can be helpful for firefighters to be able to actually, defend a structure when a fire is occurring in the area. In the more forested areas, especially like in mixed conifer forest, these like commercial thinning projects, there's a question about whether or not they're really doing much. This is from some work that I did over the last year or so since the Caldor fire. If you may remember, the Caldor fire burned last year, went off toward Lake Tahoe. This is in the Sierra Nevada. And all these like hashed areas, these are areas that have been commercially thinned over the preceding couple of decades. And you can see the fire, it started over here. It burned right through these thinned areas. It burned down this community of Grizzly Flats. And a lot of these burned at high severity. In fact, on this day, I think this was like a 2-day run that the fire was making. What you're seeing is a fire severity map. So the red is high severity. You can see when it was being driven by these extreme winds, and it moved across this large landscape in a couple of days, it mostly burned at high severity, regardless of whether it had been thinned or not. So again, in these extreme weather events, these projects just don't work very well. And then you add in the fact that they cause all these ecological issues when they're being implemented, and it just doesn't add up to this being a very effective approach on the landscape. If you want to see some more about all of this, especially in relation to forest, I've published a couple of papers this year. This one was about the Caldor fire specifically, but we also I co-authored a paper earlier this year that is more broadly about our approach as a society to, especially land management agencies like the Forest Service, that approach to dealing with wildfire in the Western United States. So where do we go from here? This project is currently in this stage. They've just proposed it. There's a scoping comment period right now. This is the scoping period, is what it's called, and it has to undergo National Environmental Policy Act review. And what should happen is when a project is proposed, the agency, the Forest Service in this case, they should look at this question of, are significant impacts to the environment likely? If you're unsure, then that's when you go to an environmental assessment. You do an environmental assessment, and then you determine whether or not significant impacts are likely. If they are, then you would prepare an environmental impact statement, which is a much more robust form of environmental review. In this case, the Forest Service, what they should have found very quickly was that with a 235,000 acre project that affects a lot of different ecosystems, a lot of critical habitat for endangered and threatened species, for sensitive species, so many impacts are likely. I mean, it's astounding that they didn't immediately say, you know what, significant impacts are likely, therefore we should just go straight to an environmental impact statement. They have instead said, we're going to prepare an environmental assessment, and that will likely follow this path, which I know this is kind of a crazy flow chart here, but they will issue an environmental assessment. They will issue something called a finding of no significant impact, and then that will lead to a period where people can object to what they have found and try to get changes made to their eventual decision. And so we have been advocating, and we are really laying out, I think, a strong case that they should be preparing an environmental impact statement from the very get-go. But they very well may go through this environmental assessment process, which would be unfortunate because it's not as robust of an environmental review process as the impact statement. They also, because of the Trump administration, the changes that were made to how the National Environmental Policy Act is implemented, these documents are limited. Like the environmental assessment, they have to complete it in 1 year, and it can only be like 75 pages long. Our comment letter to the Forest Service about this project is going to be longer than that. And so it's, I mean, this is a really serious issue that this project is not going to get the environmental review that it is absolutely in need of. And just to put a finer point on this, the Forest Service has prepared an environmental impact statement for similar projects in the past. Most recently, 2018, they issued their environmental impact statement for the Monterey County portion of the forest, the Monterey Ranger District. It was a big fuel break project. I mentioned it at the very beginning of this presentation. It was only 542 acres in size, and they did a full environmental impact statement for it. And then now we're dealing with a project that's 235,000 acres, and they're saying they're not going to do an environmental impact statement. That is mind-boggling, and we have a major issue with that. If you want to learn more, we have put together a new website called protectyourforest.org. You can go check that out. We've got a lot of great information about this project. Definitely check out the frequently asked questions. Very, very detailed. There's probably a lot of things that I didn't cover today that you might be interested in learning about. This would be a good place to go and do that. You can also visit lpfw.org/ERP. That will take you straight to our online portal so that you can easily submit a comment to the Forest Service. It is imperative that they hear from the public. So especially if you have particular places that you're concerned about, like maybe you go to Westquester Ridge a lot and you're concerned about the potential impacts, you should go and submit a comment to the Forest Service before the September 27th deadline and tell them that. That is a very important part of this environmental review process, is this public input aspect. You can also check out our online interactive map, lpfw.org/ERP-map. This is a great place to go and see some of these places and actually explore them a little bit more. That's it. That's all I've got. So I'll take a bunch of questions now, if you've got them, and follow us and follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Okay, so here, I got a question. Someone's asking about the big Basin Fire. I read and saw that a ridge that had used fire protection techniques performed by a local tribe did not burn nearly as much as other ridges. I don't know anything about that. I haven't seen that. There has been one study that I know of that has been published about that fire, and it was about regrowth, and it's a really cool study. It came out last year, I want to say, late last year. And it's mostly about redwood regrowth. So I'm sorry, I don't know anything about that. But again, if fire, I could give a whole presentation about how we classify fire severity in post-fire areas using satellite imagery. And so if you remember when I showed that redwood area right after the fire, it will show up in the fire severity data sets that are based on that immediate post-fire imagery. It will absolutely show up as high severity fire. But severity, it depends on how you define severity. If you're defining it as tree mortality, that area did not burn at high severity. It burned at high intensity, but it didn't burn at high severity because most of the mature trees that were there, most of the overstory dominant trees survived. They lost their canopy, but they're redeveloping it. So I think how we define severity in redwood forest is it needs some adjustment. So I would need to take a closer look about that. Oh yeah, we have a good question. I should have mentioned this. One of the other cool species in the Monterey Ranger District that is included, I mean, like areas where you would find this species included in this project area, is the Santa Lucia fir. That is the rarest fir on Earth. It only occurs in the Big Sur area. Fascinating species. It's also called the bristlecone fir. But yeah, there's a lot of occurrences, known occurrences of that species within the project area. How it could be impacted. It is a Forest Service sensitive species. They're supposed to they're not supposed to cause significant impacts to it, but I don't know how they wouldn't with what they're proposing. So yeah, good question. I got another question. Is the Forest Service proposing projects like this due to the money for forest thinning and fuels reduction in the infrastructure bill? To quote people from the Midwest, you betcha. Absolutely. These projects, and in fact, that's been kind of the primary answer we've gotten from the Forest Service directly is, why are you doing this project? It's like, there's a lot of money to do it, and I gave a presentation last night where I hate going down this sort of line of thinking, but a lot of what is pushing this is just good old fashioned, bureaucracy and um, congressional funding. I mean, Congress has been, I think what's happening is that a lot of elected officials, a lot of politicians, they hear a lot of concerns from their constituents about wildfire. And of course, we've had some really big fire seasons over the last few years. And so they have to show that they're doing something. And what they will do is they just allocate more money to the things that we've already been doing on the landscape for decades that haven't been working. And they just sort of double down on all of that. And so they're like, oh, we have a bunch of wildfire in California. Yeah, let's just put billions of dollars into vegetation management in California. That'll fix it. But that's not what's going to fix that issue. The reason fire activity has increased so drastically in the last couple of decades is climate change, primarily. In Southern California, it has a lot to do also with human-caused ignition increases, and especially in relation to like power line ignitions. But it's extremely dry conditions with extreme winds. If you've got an ignition under those conditions, there's not much that you can do on the landscape beforehand that's going to change the outcome of that fire. That's the problem. And going out there and doing a bunch of commercial thinning or mastication, that's not going to change wind patterns. That's not going to change how embers move across the landscape. So this is an exercise in futility in the long run, and it's a big waste of money. But a lot of people, are going to benefit from it. Like the timber industry will benefit from these things because they'll get contracted to do a lot of the work. Um, the Forest Service, every national forest now is vying for this big pot of money to try to do these projects. That's why this project is being proposed, is so that they can do an environmental assessment, cover 235,000 acres as quickly as possible, so that they can say, look, we're shovel ready, give us the money, and we can just go out and do all this work now. I should have mentioned at the beginning, this environmental review process is being funded by PG&E. This is really bizarre. We've never seen anything like this, but PG&E, the utility company, gave the Forest Service $1.7 million to do an environmental analysis on this project. The Forest Service then gave a lot of that money to a private consulting firm in Montana to do the work. So they've contracted out to some consulting firm in Montana to do this work. And my guess is that this will eventually lead to PG&E funding some of the actual work on the ground once they've done the environmental review. It's bizarre. It's really, really weird. Cool. Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's cool. I don't know anything about what the Sempervirens Fund is doing out there. Um, yeah, that's interesting. I would want to see I would want to see some data about how different you know management is affecting fire severity in redwoods, because again, I haven't seen any publications on that, especially related to the CZU complex. Um, yeah. Oh, how does the Los Padres National Forest defend fuel break conversion to grasses? They don't defend it. They don't have good answers for that. I guess their justification. Here's what they would say. Um, they'll say, well, we've got to do fuel breaks because that will help mitigate fire spread across the landscape. And in chaparral areas, uh, chaparral is burning too frequently in a lot of places. So putting fuel breaks on the landscape is a good thing because it can help keep certain areas from burning. That's what they'll say. But again, fuel breaks don't work when you have weather driven fire events. And those fires are the ones that cause the vast majority of acreage burned every year. So yeah, okay, maybe your fuel break can help stop a fire in like March that breaks out and isn't being driven by 40-mile, 50-mile per hour winds, and vegetation moisture is really high. You could the Forest Service is stopping those fires with or without fuel breaks. I don't think it's a very good justification. But my concern is that these fuel breaks that lead to swaths of type conversion on the landscape, they are they're running a risk of increasing ignitions on the landscape, which then could exacerbate the fire frequency issue that we do see in chaparral. So yeah, they don't have a good defense for this from our view. The science doesn't really back up the use of fuel breaks, especially in chaparral, to try to mitigate large wildfires. So yeah, and the impacts in terms of invasive plant spread are basically unavoidable. They'll include some like mitigation measures. They'll say, you know, we'll wash the equipment as we, you know, like between, you know, going from this area or this treatment unit, we'll wash the masticators, you know, track wheels, whatever. We'll wash those before we go to the next unit. That's not the issue. I mean, that's not going to solve this problem. What you've just done is caused a massive ground disturbance, probably in areas that already have some invasive plants. And anytime you cause that really intense ground disturbance, you're just creating conditions that will favor those invasive plants to do well. Wildfire doesn't quite do the same thing. Like in Chaparral, you won't find, you know, mature chaparral that burns that didn't have any invasive plants. It won't suddenly become dominated by invasive plants, and that's because you don't get that same like ground disturbance. And there's a lot of other reasons too. I think there's some complexity to that, but yeah, it's interesting. Hopefully, I've answered your questions. Let's see here. Is the final decision made by the Los Padres forest supervisor, or is it higher? Yeah, there is a new forest supervisor. Any sense of this, that might affect the outcome of the planning process? No, definitely not. I'm not getting any sense that the new forest supervisor is is wanting to do the right thing on this particular project. But I will say, it will probably be signed, the decision would probably be signed by the forest supervisor. Occasionally you'll see it signed by like a regional forester. That's pretty rare. I don't think that'll happen. If it's signed by the forest supervisor and then like our organization or any other organization or individual files an objection, that will then go to the regional forester and you'll talk with the regional forest office. I've been a part of those objection processes before. They can be useful to some extent, but yeah, I don't know how this is going to play out. I think in some ways, I really think that the Forest Service has maybe proposed something crazy so that they can then reduce it in size and say, look, we're being reasonable. So if you start with a 235,000 acre project and then say, well, we'll reduce it down to 150,000 acres, that will sound like they're being, I guess, a little bit reasonable, but it would still be crazy. We've mostly been dealing with projects that are like a couple thousand acres or less. So this is just a huge, huge shift. And we do have some, indication that they might change the size of it down the road, but we just don't know yet. I mean, we're not far enough along in the process. Are they amenable to putting on a presentation of this project and having Q&A? They have done actually a couple of their own webinars about this, which is, they kind of give their own spin on what they're proposing here. And they allow questions, but I don't think they answer them very well. And I don't know how useful it'll be, but they're really not addressing these concerns that we're bringing up. And we've brought them up with past projects. I mean, we submitted a 100-page technical comment letter on the Pine Mountain project that I thought laid out a very strong case for why they should not be doing what they were proposing. And they basically completely dismissed it and approved their project anyway. So it's an unfortunate situation that we're in, where the agency is just not listening to organizations, to a lot of scientists, to the public. Thousands of people have already submitted comments opposing this project. The Forest Service, should be listening to that, but they will find their ways to dismiss the concerns of large groups of people, and that is unfortunate. And yeah, so great questions so far. Appreciate it. And yeah, thank you to folks who are saying thanks for the presentation. Yeah, that's what we're here for. We're trying to be an educational resource. I recommend checking out our new website about this project. I think you can learn a lot there. You can reach out to us as well. Follow us on Instagram. I do a lot of stuff on Instagram about, it's mostly like plant education, ecosystem education stuff. If you're curious about like fires elsewhere, happening in California, and you want to see some cool maps, I've got a Twitter where I post some of my mapping work on those fires. I haven't been able to tweet much lately because of this project, but yeah, there's plenty of ways you can sort of get in touch with us and learn more. But I'm not seeing any new questions. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm here as long as you guys want to talk. So if you've got questions, there's no dumb questions, no questions too small or too big that we can't try to address here. So, and for those of you watching at a later date, if you're on our YouTube channel, hopefully I think you should see some links down below that could lead to like our project, the new website for the project, some of our other important links. And if you're on the website, I think we'll have this embedded on the website. So, check that out. Is there a timetable for this work? That's a great question. I would expect if they go down the route of preparing an environmental assessment, if they're going by that like 1 year rule, then we should see an environmental assessment come out in about a year. And then that'll be a draft environmental assessment. There'll be another comment period. And then they will issue a final environmental assessment. I don't know how long after that. And then they will open up an objection period. That's a 45-day objection period. And then there'll be a couple months after that ends where we go through the objection process, if that's what people end up doing. And then they will issue a decision notice, and then project work could start after that. So, I mean, it could be a couple years down the road, but it could also be a really protracted thing where they do an EA and then people object or even, file a lawsuit, and then a court finds that they actually should have done an environmental impact statement. So then they go do an environmental impact statement, and then, people object or they find that they didn't fully address all these, major concerns. So yeah, it could be quite a ways down the road before you actually see work being done, but definitely important to take this proposal very seriously. This is the biggest proposal of its kind that we've ever seen in the Los Padres, probably the largest in California and possibly in the Western United States. So, I mean, this is a really major thing that's being proposed here, and it will set a precedent, I think, for other national forests to do something similar. If they can push through a big, massive or hundreds of thousands of acres project under a single environmental assessment, we will see that all over the country start happening. And so this is an important project to push back on. The actual work, I see what you're talking about. Yeah. When would the actual work start? Hard to say. I don't think I have a good answer for you, but oops. So yeah, it could be years away. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any new questions, but hopefully I've answered all your questions so far, and feel free to get in touch with me if you'd like. Again, comment period ends on September 27th, so definitely get your comments in before that. But feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And if you're in, this won't really be relevant to people who are watching later, but if you are in the area and want to do a hike with us, we're actually I'll be leading a hike on this Sunday at 9:30 a.m. Over by Figueroa Mountain in Santa Barbara County. We're going to be hiking down Davy Brown trail into the project area, and I'll be talking about the project, but also talking about native plants and wildlife. It'll be really fun. We've done a lot of these kind of hikes this year. Really fun educational things. So if you're interested in that, I'm just going to put it in the chat real quick. The link that you would go to. It's pretty simple. You can go sign up there. It's free. Okay, so I think that will probably do it. Thank you all for watching at a later date, watching from home. Thank you for attending this, and thanks for everyone that was here today to ask questions.